Katie Morgan had always loved the ocean because it was the one place where she could escape from the noise and stress of her everyday life in the busy city, where everything moved too fast and nobody had time to breathe. She drove 3 hours every weekend to reach this quiet spot where the water was deep and dark and the shore was far enough away that she could pretend the rest of the world did not exist. Her small fishing boat was nothing special, just an old vessel she had bought from a retired fisherman who told her it had good bones and would serve her well if she treated it right. The morning sun was just starting to climb above the horizon when Katie cast her line into the water and settled back with her coffee to wait for whatever the ocean decided to offer. She had been coming to this spot for 2 years and had caught some impressive fish, but today felt different in a way she could not quite explain. The air seemed charged with electricity and the water looked darker than usual, as if something massive was moving far below where light could not reach. Katie checked her equipment and made sure everything was secure, because the last thing she needed was to lose her favorite rod to a strong current or a big catch. An hour passed with nothing but small tugs that turned out to be seaweed, and she was starting to think about moving to a different location. Then her rod nearly jumped out of her hands as something grabbed the line with incredible force that made the boat lurch sideways and water splash over the edge. Katie scrambled to grab the rod with both hands and braced her feet against the side of the boat, as whatever she had hooked pulled with strength that seemed impossible. Her arms burned with effort and sweat ran down her face as she fought to hold on while the line cut through the water at high speed. This was not a fish, because no fish pulled like this with steady, unstoppable force that felt more like a machine than a living creature. Drag on her reel screamed as line disappeared into the deep, and Katie knew she should cut it loose before whatever was down there pulled her overboard. But something made her hold on. Maybe curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, or maybe just the feeling that this was important in ways she did not understand yet. Minutes felt like hours as she struggled, and her hands were cramping and her shoulders ached. But slowly, very slowly, she began to win the battle. The line started coming back, and whatever was attached began rising from the depths toward the surface, where morning light danced on gentle waves. Katie's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears as a shape began to form beneath the water, growing larger and more defined with each passing second. At first she thought it might be a submarine or some kind of research equipment that had broken loose from a ship, but as it broke the surface, she saw that it was neither of those things, and her mind struggled to make sense of what her eyes were showing her. The object was made of metal that seemed to shift colors from silver to blue to purple, depending on how the light hit it. Barnacles and seaweed covered parts of it. But beneath the ocean growth, she could see smooth surfaces and strange symbols that looked like no writing system she had ever seen. The craft was roughly oval, shaped about the size of a large truck, and it had sections that glowed with soft blue light, even in the bright morning sun. Katie's fishing line was tangled around what looked like a damaged fin or wing on the side of the vessel. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone because she needed to call someone, the Coast Guard or the Navy, or somebody who would know what to do with an alien spacecraft, because that was what this had to be. Nothing made by human hands looked like this or felt like this, with energy that seemed to pulse through the air. Before she could dial, a hatch on the top of the craft opened with a hiss of air and steam, and Katie dropped her phone as her entire body froze with fear. Something was inside and it was moving, and in a moment it would emerge, and she would see what had been hiding beneath the ocean for who knows how long. Part of her wanted to start the engine and race back to shore as fast as the old boat could go, but a larger part of her needed to know, needed to see what would happen next, even if it meant facing something beyond her understanding. A hand appeared gripping the edge of the hatch, and it was pale like moonlight, with long, elegant fingers that did not look quite human. Then a face emerged, and Katie gasped, because she was looking at a woman who was beautiful in a way that seemed almost painful to witness. She had features that were delicate and sharp at the same time, with high cheekbones and a narrow chin, and ears that came to points like something from a fantasy story. Her skin shimmered like pearl, and her eyes glowed with warm amber light that seemed to look directly into Katie's soul. Long silver hair fell past her shoulders, moving in the breeze like liquid metal, and when she climbed out of the craft, Katie saw she was tall and graceful, wearing clothes made of material that looked like woven starlight behind. Her two more shapes emerged, and Katie's breath caught in her throat because they were dragons, small ones with scales and wings and eyes full of ancient intelligence. One had scales that shifted between emerald and sapphire while the other gleamed like polished bronze, and both of them looked at Katie with curiosity rather than aggression. The strange woman stood on top of her damaged spacecraft and spoke in a language that sounded like music mixed with wind chimes. Katie could not understand the words, but somehow feelings and images flooded into her mind, showing her that this being had been trapped underwater for a very long time. The woman's expression was a mixture of relief and urgency, and even though they could not speak the same language, Katie understood that something important was about to begin. The elf woman stepped carefully onto the surface of her floating spacecraft and held up one hand in what Katie hoped was a peaceful gesture. The two dragons moved to stand beside their companion, and Katie noticed they kept their wings folded and their heads lowered as if trying to appear less threatening. Katie's logical mind told her to be afraid, but something deeper, something instinctive made her feel that this strange visitor meant no harm. The woman spoke again, and this time Katie felt words forming in her thoughts like someone was gently placing ideas directly into her brain. The sensation was strange, but not painful, and gradually Katie began to understand what the elf woman was trying to communicate. Her name was something beautiful, that Katie's mind translated as Lyra, though she suspected the real name was far more complex and musical. Lyra had come from a distant world so far away that human telescopes had never seen it, and her people had been watching over Earth for thousands of years. They were guardians who protected humanity from dangers that most people never knew existed, threats that came from the dark spaces between stars. Lyra had been chasing something evil through space when her ship was damaged in a battle, and she crashed into Earth's ocean more than 300 years ago. The impact had damaged her vessel's power systems and left her trapped beneath the waves, unable to repair the craft or send a signal for help. She had survived by entering a kind of sleep that slowed her aging and kept her alive while her ship's automatic systems worked to fix themselves. The dragons had slept beside her, waiting for the day when their guardian would wake and continue the mission that had brought them to Earth now. After centuries, the repairs were finally complete enough for the ship to respond to outside interference, which was why Katie's fishing line had triggered the awakening. Lyra's amber eyes fixed on Katie with intensity as she shared the most important part of her message. The creature she had been hunting all those years ago was still on Earth, hiding somewhere among humans, growing stronger with each passing decade. It was a being of shadow and hunger that fed on fear and conflict, and if it was not stopped soon, it would become powerful enough to destroy everything. Katie felt her stomach tighten as she absorbed this information, because it sounded like something from a movie, not real life. But the spacecraft floating in front of her was definitely real. And so was the elf woman and her dragons. Lyra needed help because 300 years was a long time, and the world had changed in ways she could not understand from beneath the ocean. She needed someone who knew this modern Earth, someone who could help her navigate human society and track down the dark entity before it was too late. Katie wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, because she was nobody special, just a woman who worked in an office and went fishing on weekends. But Lyra was looking at her with such hope and determination that Katie found herself nodding before she fully realized what she was agreeing to. The elf woman's face brightened, and she made a gesture that caused one of the dragons, the green and blue one, to spread its wings. The creature leaped gracefully from the spacecraft and landed on Katie's boat, making the vessel rock dangerously. Up close, the dragon was even more magnificent, with scales that caught the light like jewels and eyes that showed remarkable intelligence. It sniffed Katie carefully, then made a soft chirping sound that seemed friendly. Lyra sent another thought message explaining that the dragon's name was Whisper, and he was offering to bond with Katie temporarily. This bond would allow them to understand each other better and would give Katie some protection against the dangers they would face. Katie reached out slowly and touched the dragon's head, feeling warmth and energy flow from the scales into her hand. The sensation spread through her body like warm honey, and suddenly she could sense Whisper's emotions: curiosity, affection, and fierce loyalty. She could also feel Lyra more clearly now, as if the dragon was acting as a bridge between their minds. The elf woman sent feelings of gratitude and urgency, along with images of what they needed to do next. First, they had to get to shore because Lyra's ship could not stay afloat much longer and would soon sink back to the bottom. Katie needed to bring them to land somewhere, quiet where they would not be seen by too many people. Then they would need supplies and information because Lyra had to learn about the modern world before they could begin hunting the dark entity. Katie glanced at her small boat and then at the two dragons and the tall elf woman and wondered how they were all going to fit. Lyra seemed to understand her concern and made another gesture. The spacecraft began to sink slowly beneath the waves, and the second dragon, the bronze one, jumped down to join Whisper on the boat. Lyra followed, moving with impossible grace, and Katie noticed her feet barely seemed to touch the surface. The boat sat lower in the water with all the added weight, but it held steady. Katie moved to the controls and started the engine, which sputtered to life after a few tries. She pointed the boat toward shore and began the journey back, wondering what she was going to tell people when they saw her passengers. Lyra touched her shoulder and sent a reassuring thought. The elf woman could make herself and the dragons invisible to most humans using an ability that bent light and perception. Only Katie would see them clearly because of her bond with Whisper. This made things slightly less terrifying, but Katie still felt like her life had just taken a turn into complete chaos. The bronze dragon, whose name came through as Ember, curled up near the front of the boat, while Whisper stayed close to Katie. Lyra stood beside her, looking out at the approaching shoreline with an expression that mixed wonder and sadness. Katie realized the elf woman was seeing the surface world for the first time in 3 centuries, and everything would be strange and new as they got closer to land. Katie's mind raced with questions about where they would go and how she would hide 2 dragons in her apartment. But those were problems for later. Right now, she just focused on steering the boat and trying to accept that her quiet, ordinary life was gone forever. Lyra's hand remained on, her shoulder steady and warm, and despite everything, Katie felt a strange excitement building in her chest. She was part of something bigger now, something important and dangerous and completely impossible. The shore grew closer, and Katie took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever came next in this adventure she never asked for, but somehow knew she was meant to experience. The boat reached the small dock just as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Katie was grateful that this early in the morning few people were around. She tied up the vessel with shaking hands while Lyra and the dragons waited patiently behind. Her true to the elf woman's word, nobody seemed to notice the unusual passengers, as a couple of fishermen walked past heading toward their own boats. Katie could see Lyra and the dragons clearly, but the fishermen looked right through them as if they were not there at all. It was unsettling to watch, and Katie wondered what else Lyra could do with her strange abilities. They made their way to Katie's truck in the parking lot, and she was relieved to find it empty of other people. The dragons climbed into the back seat with surprising ease, and Lyra slid into the passenger seat. Moving with that same impossible grace, Katie started the engine and pulled out onto the highway, heading toward her apartment, while her mind spun with the reality of what was happening. Through her bond with Whisper, she could feel the dragon's excitement at seeing the world rush past the windows. Ember was more cautious, sending out waves of alertness, as if watching for threats. Lyra sat very still, taking in everything, with wide eyes as they passed cars and buildings and signs. Katie realized the elf woman had last seen Earth when horses were the main transportation, and the tallest buildings were made of stone. She tried to imagine what it must feel like to wake up in a world that had transformed so completely. The drive took 40 minutes, and Katie spent most of it worrying about how she would explain any of this if someone saw her guests. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an older building with neighbors, who mostly kept to themselves. She parked in her usual spot and led the group up the stairs, hoping the invisibility effect would hold. Inside her small apartment, Katie finally let out the breath she had been holding. Lyra looked around at the furniture and appliances with fascination, touching things gently, as if trying to understand their purpose. The dragons explored, sniffing everything and making soft sounds of curiosity. Whisper seemed particularly interested in the television, while Ember investigated the kitchen. Katie collapsed onto her couch and put her head in her hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. She had gone fishing and caught a spaceship, and now she had an elf woman and 2 dragons in her apartment. Lyra sat down beside her and placed a comforting hand on Katie's back. Through their connection, Katie felt the elf woman's gratitude and also her regret for putting this burden on someone who had just wanted a peaceful morning on the water. But there was also determination and hope and a deep sense of purpose that helped steady Katie's racing thoughts. Katie looked up and met those glowing amber eyes and asked through their mental link what they should do next. Lyra's response came as a flood of information and planning. First, they needed to gather knowledge about the modern world, especially technology and current events. The elf woman needed to understand how humans lived now and what had changed in 300 years. Then they would begin searching for signs of the dark entity, which would be drawn to places where negative emotions were strongest. Lyra explained that the creature fed on anger, fear, hatred, and despair, so it would hide somewhere that generated these feelings constantly. Katie thought about the news she watched every night, full of conflict and suffering, and realized there were too many places that fit that description. Lyra agreed, but said the entity would have a lair, a central place where it had grown strong, and from where it influenced events. They would need to sense its energy signature, which Lyra could do. But it would take time, and they would have to travel to different locations. Katie felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were facing, but she also felt Whisper's confidence flowing through their bond. The dragon believed in Lyra completely, and that faith was contagious. Katie got up and made coffee while trying to think practically about their situation. She had vacation time saved up at work, so she could take a few weeks off without raising suspicions. Money would be tight, but she had some savings, and maybe they could figure things out as they went. Lyra came to stand beside her in the kitchen, and Katie showed her how the coffee maker worked. Elf woman was fascinated by the technology and asked questions through their mental connection that Katie did her best to answer. Where the next few hours, Katie brought out her laptop and began showing Lyra the internet. The elf woman's eyes grew wider as she absorbed information about how much the world had changed. She learned about cars and planes and phones and computers, with the quick understanding of someone whose mind was built for processing complex information. Katie ordered food delivery, which amazed Lyra when it arrived at the door 30 minutes later. The dragons were equally impressed and enjoyed the pizza Katie had ordered, though she suspected their digestive systems could handle things humans could not. As evening approached, Katie felt exhaustion creeping in from the emotional roller coaster of the day, but Lyra was energized by everything she had learned and eager to begin their mission. Through Whisper, Katie felt the dragon's concern for her well-being, and his gentle suggestion that she rest. Lyra immediately looked apologetic and agreed that Katie needed sleep. The elf woman explained that she and the dragons required very little rest and could keep watch through the night. Katie showed them how to use the television remote, which entertained them greatly, and then stumbled to her bedroom. She collapsed on her bed, still wearing her fishing clothes, and expected to lie awake worrying about everything. But the bond with Whisper brought with it a sense of calm and safety that helped her relax. She could feel the dragon's presence in the other room, alert and protective. Just before sleep took her, Katie wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether she was brave enough to face the challenges ahead. Through the bond, Whisper sent feelings of confidence and affection, along with the clear message that she was not alone. Lyra's voice whispered in her mind, thanking her again and promising that together they would stop the darkness threatening humanity. Katie drifted off with those reassuring thoughts wrapping around her like a blanket. In the living room, Lyra sat watching the news with growing understanding of the modern world's problems. The dragons curled up on either side of her, and she stroked their scales while thinking about the hunt that would begin tomorrow. She had waited 300 years for this chance, and she would not fail. The dark entity had grown strong, but it did not know she was free, and that gave them an advantage. Lyra looked toward Katie's bedroom and felt gratitude for this brave human who had chosen to help, despite having every reason to run away. Tomorrow they would begin tracking their enemy, and Lyra would teach Katie some of the skills she would need to survive what was coming. The elf woman smiled slightly as Whisper sent her feelings of his approval of their new companion. Even Ember, who was usually more reserved, seemed to have accepted Katie into their small family. Lyra settled back and continued, watching the television, learning everything she could about this strange new version of Earth. The night passed quietly, while three beings from another world kept watch over a sleeping human who had become their unexpected ally in a battle that would determine the fate of millions. Katie woke to sunlight streaming through her window, and for a moment she thought the previous day had been some kind of vivid dream. Then she felt Whisper's presence in her mind like a warm glow, and knew that everything had really happened. She got up and found Lyra sitting cross-legged on the floor with both dragons watching the television, which was showing the morning news. The elf woman looked up and smiled, and Katie felt a wave of greeting through their connection. Lyra had spent the entire night learning about the modern world, and she was ready to share what she had discovered over breakfast, which consisted of cereal for Katie and some kind of energy that Lyra seemed to absorb from the air itself. The elf woman explained her findings. She had identified several locations where the dark entity's influence seemed strongest, based on patterns she recognized in news reports and online discussions. There were 3 cities that showed signs of the creature's presence, places where conflict and suffering had increased dramatically over the past decade. They would need to visit each location and use Lyra's abilities to sense whether the entity was actually there or just leaving its influence behind. Katie felt nervous about traveling to potentially dangerous places, but she also felt Whisper's steady confidence supporting her. Lyra could sense her worry and explained that she would teach Katie some basic techniques for protecting her mind and body. The elf woman said that humans had potential that most never learned to access because they did not believe in such things. But Katie already had a bond with Whisper, which meant her mind was open to possibilities beyond normal human experience. They spent the morning with Lyra, showing Katie how to sense energy around her and how to create a simple shield in her thoughts. It was difficult at first, like trying to use muscles Katie never knew she had, but with Whisper's help, feeding her confidence and strength, she began to feel something responding to her efforts. By afternoon, Katie could maintain a basic mental shield for several minutes before it collapsed from her lack of practice. Lyra praised her progress and said that with more training, Katie would become quite capable of defending herself. The dragons also seemed pleased, purring and rubbing against Katie in approval. That evening, they packed supplies for their first trip to a city 3 hours north, where strange events had been reported frequently. Lyra had found news articles about unexplained violence and a general atmosphere of tension that seemed worse than other similar cities. Katie called her boss and requested 2 weeks of vacation time, claiming she needed to visit a sick relative. Her boss agreed easily since Katie rarely took time off and was a reliable worker. They left early the next morning with Katie driving, and Lyra studying maps on the laptop while the dragons watched the scenery. The elf woman was getting better at understanding modern technology, though some things still confused her. She could not grasp why humans needed so many different apps to do simple tasks when her people had tools that could perform multiple functions. Katie tried to explain about companies and profits, but Lyra just shook her head in bewilderment at the inefficiency. As they got closer to their destination, Katie felt the atmosphere change. Even without Lyra's abilities, she could sense something wrong in the air, like a heaviness that pressed down on her chest. Through Whisper, she felt the dragon becoming more alert, scanning for threats. Lyra's expression grew serious, and she placed one hand on the dashboard, as if sensing vibrations. The elf woman confirmed that the dark entity had definitely been here, and its influence was thick in this place. They checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town and waited until dark to begin their search. Lyra explained that the entity would be more active at night when fear and negative emotions ran higher. Katie changed into dark clothes and tried not to think too hard about what they were doing. She was just an ordinary person, and yet here she was preparing to hunt an ancient evil with an alien guardian and 2 dragons. Lyra must have sensed her thoughts because she took Katie's hand and sent feelings of reassurance. The elf woman reminded her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act, despite it. Katie had already shown great bravery by accepting this mission, and Lyra trusted her completely. Those words helped settle Katie's nerves, and she nodded with determination. They left the motel under cover of Lyra's invisibility effect and walked through the dark streets. The city felt wrong in ways Katie could not quite describe, like the shadows were deeper, and the air tasted bitter. Whisper stayed close to her side, and she kept one hand on his scales, drawing comfort from the contact. Ember scouted ahead, using his connection with Lyra to communicate what he found. They walked for over an hour through neighborhoods that grew progressively more run-down and desperate. Katie saw homeless people huddled in doorways and graffiti that spoke of anger and hopelessness. Lyra stopped suddenly in front of an abandoned building that looked like it might have been a factory once. The elf woman's eyes glowed brighter as she focused her senses on the structure. She turned to Katie and sent a clear message through their bond. The entity was inside, and it knew they were. Here Katie's heart began racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. Lyra created a stronger invisibility shield around them and led the way to a broken window. They climbed through into darkness that felt alive with malevolence. The dragons moved silently beside them, and Katie noticed their scales were glowing faintly, providing just enough light to see. They made their way through empty rooms filled with trash and evidence of people who had sheltered here, but those people were gone now, and Katie had a sick feeling about what might have happened to them. Finally, they reached a large open space that must have been the main factory floor. In the center, something moved in the shadows, something that hurt to look at directly. It was like a tear, in reality itself, a presence that existed between dimensions. Katie felt overwhelming fear trying to paralyze her, but Whisper pushed back with fierce determination. Lyra stepped forward and began speaking in her musical language. Light gathered around her hands, and the dragons moved to flank her. The entity responded with a sound like grinding metal and breaking glass. It surged toward them, taking form as it moved, becoming a thing of claws and teeth and burning eyes. Katie screamed but held her ground, activating the mental shield Lyra had taught her. The elf woman released a burst of brilliant energy that struck the creature and made it shriek. Ember and Whisper breathed streams of fire that were not quite fire, but something that burned away shadow and lies. The entity fought back, lashing out with tendrils of darkness that tried to pierce their defenses. Katie felt one tendril touch her shield, and suddenly she was flooded with visions of her worst fears. She saw herself alone and forgotten her life meaningless and empty. But through the bond, Whisper roared defiance and showed her the truth. She was not alone. She was part of something important, and her actions mattered. The vision shattered, and Katie pushed back with her own. Lyra was chanting now, and symbols of light formed in the air around the creature, binding it in place. The entity thrashed and screamed, but the elf woman's power held strong. With a final surge of energy, Lyra thrust her hands forward, and the light became a spear that pierced the creature's core. It exploded into fragments of shadow that dissolved like smoke in the wind. Then there was only silence and the empty factory and four beings catching their breath. Katie fell to her knees, shaking with adrenaline and relief. Lyra knelt beside her and placed gentle hands on her shoulders, sending waves of healing calm. The elf woman explained that what they had fought was just a fragment, a piece of the main entity. The real creature was still out there, and it was much more powerful. But tonight they had won a small victory and saved this city from further corruption. Katie looked up at Lyra and saw pride and gratitude in those amber eyes. She had faced true darkness and survived, and that made her stronger than she had been before. They returned to the motel in silence, each processing what had happened in their own way. Katie's hand still shook as she unlocked the door, and once inside she sat on the bed trying to make sense of the battle. Lyra sat beside her, and through their bond explained more about what they faced. The dark entity was ancient, older than human civilization, and it had been feeding on Earth's negative emotions for thousands of years. It had grown clever over time, learning to hide and influence events without revealing itself. The fragment they destroyed tonight was like a finger. The main body was still somewhere gathering strength. Lyra had wounded it badly 300 years ago before her crash, and that was why it had been cautious. But now, it knew she was free and active again, and it would be preparing for a real confrontation. Katie asked through Whisper how they could possibly defeat something so powerful. Lyra smiled and sent reassurance along with images and feelings that explained her plan. The entity drew power from darkness and fear, but it could be weakened by hope, courage, and unity. Humanity had grown strong in ways it did not realize, and if enough people stood together with pure intention, they could banish the creature forever. But first they needed to find its main lair and learn its current form because it could take many shapes. They would visit the other two cities Lyra had identified and gather more information. Each fragment they destroyed would weaken the whole and give them clues about where the center was hiding. Katie nodded, understanding that this was going to be a longer journey than she had imagined. Over the next 2 weeks, they traveled to the other cities and found fragments in both places. Each battle was different, and each taught Katie something new about using the abilities Lyra was helping her develop. She learned to sense the entity's presence before they got close, and she got better at maintaining her mental shields under pressure. Whispers. Bond grew stronger until Katie could sometimes see through the dragon's eyes and feel his strength, as if it were her own. Ember warmed to her as well, and both dragons began teaching her things through feelings and instinct. She learned that dragons were not just powerful creatures but ancient souls who had chosen to bond with guardians like Lyra. They were partners in the truest sense, working together to protect life across many worlds. Katie felt honored to be included, even temporarily, in such a relationship. After destroying the third fragment, Lyra gathered them in another cheap motel room and shared what she had learned. Each fragment had contained memories of the main entity's location, and by combining these memories, Lyra had found where it was hiding. The creature had made its lair in the heart of the largest city on this continent, buried deep beneath the streets in old tunnels that humans had forgotten. It had been there for over a century, slowly spreading its influence upward, into the millions of people living above. The upcoming battle would be far more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. The entity would be at full strength in its lair, and it would have defenses and traps prepared. Lyra looked at Katie with serious eyes and gave her a choice. She could stay behind where it was safe while Lyra and the dragons finished the mission. Katie had already helped more than anyone could ask, and no one would blame her for stepping back. Now Katie felt fear at the thought of facing the main entity, but she also felt something stronger. She had come this far and seen what this creature did to innocent people. She had the power to help stop it, even if that power was small compared to Lyra's. And more than that, she had become part of this team, this family, and she would not abandon them now. She told Lyra through their bond that she was going all the way to the end. The elf woman's face showed pride and affection, and she pulled Katie into a hug that felt like being wrapped in starlight. Whisper and Ember both nuzzled against them, making happy sounds, and Katie felt their approval flowing through the connections. They spent 3 days preparing, traveling to the big city, and gathering supplies. Lyra taught Katie advanced techniques for protecting her mind, and how to channel energy through her bond with Whisper. The dragon showed her how to see in darkness, and how to sense danger before it manifested. Katie practiced until she could do these things, without thinking about them consciously. Finally, they were ready, and they descended into the old tunnels through a forgotten entrance, in an abandoned subway station. The darkness below was absolute, but the dragons provided light, and Katie's new senses helped her navigate. They went deeper than she thought possible, following Lyra's guidance through twisting passages that seemed to go on forever. The air grew thick with the entity's presence, and Katie had to constantly reinforce her mental shields. She could feel it watching them, waiting for them, drawing them into its territory. After hours of walking, they emerged into a massive chamber that must have been carved out long before humans built their city above. In the center of the chamber, the entity waited in its true form. It was huge, filling half the space with a body that shifted between solid and shadow. It had countless eyes that burned with hatred, and limbs that ended in claws sharp enough to cut reality itself. When it spoke, its voice shook the ground and tried to break their minds with despair. It told them they were too late, that it had already won because humanity was destroying itself without any help. It laughed at their hope and said that darkness would always triumph because it was the natural state of all things. Lyra stepped forward and her voice rang out clear and strong. She told the entity that it was wrong, that light had always existed alongside darkness, and always would. Humanity had problems, yes, but it also had incredible capacity for love and courage and growth, and she would not let this parasite feed on Earth any longer. The battle began with the entity lunging forward, trying to crush them with its mass. Lyra and the dragons responded with coordinated attacks that they had practiced for centuries. Katie stayed back at first, supporting them with her mental shields and watching for openings. But then she saw a tendril sneaking toward Lyra's blind spot, and without thinking, she pushed her will forward. Energy flowed through her bond with Whisper and burst from her hand, striking the tendril and burning it away. The entity noticed her then and sent a focused attack meant to break her mind. Katie felt crushing pressure trying to fill her with every fear she had ever known, but she remembered everything Lyra had taught her, and she remembered why she was fighting. She thought about all the people above who deserved to live free from this creature's influence. She thought about the friends she had made in Lyra and the dragons, and she pushed back with everything she had. The entity recoiled, surprised that a human could resist its power. That moment of surprise was all Lyra needed. The elf woman unleashed her full strength, calling on abilities she had not used in centuries. Light blazed through the chamber so bright that Katie had to close her eyes. The dragons breathed their special fire that burned away corruption and lies, and Katie added her own will to theirs, creating a combined force that the entity could not withstand. It screamed as the light pierced its body and began tearing it apart. It tried to flee, but Lyra had prepared for that, weaving a trap that held it in place. The entity fought desperately, but it was weakening with every second. Finally, with one last surge of combined power, they struck its core. The creature exploded into fragments that dissolved into nothing, leaving only clean air and silence. Katie collapsed from exhaustion, but Whisper caught her gently. Lyra knelt beside them, breathing hard but smiling with triumph. They had won, and Earth was free from the entity's influence. The journey back to the surface felt like waking from a nightmare. When they emerged into daylight, Katie noticed the city felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. People on the streets seemed more relaxed, more willing to smile at strangers. Lyra explained that without the entity's constant pressure, humanity would naturally move toward better things. There would still be problems, of course, because humans had free will and made their own choices. But those choices would no longer be poisoned by an outside force feeding on their worst impulses. They returned to Katie's apartment, and for the first time in weeks, they could truly rest. Lyra said she would need to repair her ship and return to her people to report what had happened. But she would come back to visit because Earth was under her protection, and she had made a friend here. Katie felt sad at the thought of Lyra leaving, but she understood. She asked if she could keep her bond with Whisper and was thrilled when both Lyra and the dragon agreed. Whisper would stay with her as a companion and protector, while Ember would return with Lyra. It was not a permanent goodbye, just a change in their relationship. On the day Lyra left, Katie went with her to the ocean where the ship had fully repaired itself and risen to the surface. They hugged goodbye, and Lyra promised to return within a year. The elf woman and Ember entered the spacecraft, and it rose into the sky, disappearing among the stars. Katie stood on the beach with Whisper beside her, watching until there was nothing left to see. Her life had changed forever, and she would never be the same person who went fishing that morning weeks ago. But she had gained so much: a dragon companion, new abilities, and the knowledge that she had helped save the world. She smiled and scratched Whisper behind his ear ridges, making him purr with contentment. Together they walked back toward her truck, ready to face whatever ordinary adventures came next.